Clara Blackwood's hands trembled as she placed the last pin in her hair, securing the chestnut waves that cascaded down her back. The mirror reflected a young woman she barely recognized, flushed cheeks, bright blue eyes filled with anticipation, and a simple cream dress that her mother had helped her alter for tonight's harvest dance. At 18 years old, she had never felt such nervous excitement before, especially knowing he would be there. The year was 1876, and Willow Creek, Colorado, was hardly more than a dusty crossroads with ambitious dreams. Clara had spent her entire life here, watching the small settlement grow from a handful of homesteads to a proper town with a general store, church, and even the newly constructed dance hall where tonight's festivities would take place. "Clara Elizabeth, the Hendersons are here to escort us." Her mother called from downstairs. Clara took one final glance in the mirror before grabbing her shawl. Her mother had warned her about Xavier Remington, the new ranch hand at the Henderson place. "Too handsome for his own good," she'd said with a knowing look, "and too wild to settle down." But Clara couldn't help the flutter in her chest whenever his name was mentioned. She descended the stairs carefully, conscious of her father's watchful gaze as she entered the small parlor where Mrs. Henderson and her daughter Beatrice waited. At 20, Beatrice was what the town considered an old maid, though Clara thought her quite beautiful with her golden hair and gentle smile. "Don't you look lovely?" Mrs. Henderson said warmly. "We'd best hurry. The musicians were already tuning up when we left." The evening air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke as they made their way to the dance hall. Clara's father, the town's only doctor, walked ahead with Mrs. Henderson, discussing the coming winter and how the railroad's progress might affect their small community. "Xavier brought in a wild Mustang yesterday," Beatrice whispered to Clara as they walked. "You should have seen him. I've never known anyone who could gentle a horse so quickly." Clara felt her cheeks warm. Will he be at the dance tonight?" Beatrice smiled knowingly. "He promised Pa he would come, though he's not one for social gatherings. Too many years on the trail, I suppose." The dance hall glowed with lantern light, casting a golden hue over the gathered townspeople. Musicians set up in one corner, testing their instruments while children darted between adults, burning off energy before being sent home for the evening. Clara scanned the room nervously, her eyes finally landing on a tall figure leaning against the far wall. Xavier Remington stood apart from the crowd, his broad shoulders and lean frame marking him as different from the local farmers and shopkeepers. His dark hair fell in waves just above his collar, and even from across the room, she could feel the intensity of his gaze as it swept the gathering. When their eyes met, Clara felt her breath catch. He didn't smile, merely held her gaze for a long moment before nodding slightly in acknowledgement. "He's watching you," Beatrice whispered, a hint of envy in her voice. "Don't be silly," Clara replied, though her heart raced. The evening progressed with traditional dances, and Clara found herself partnered with several young men from town, the blacksmith's son, a clerk from the general store, and even the young deputy who had recently arrived to assist the aging sheriff. Yet through each dance, she was acutely aware of Xavier's presence, his eyes following her movements. When the musicians announced a brief rest, Clara slipped outside for air, the heat of the crowded hall becoming overwhelming. The night air cooled her flushed skin as she stood on the small porch, gazing up at stars that seemed to blanket the sky. Not fond of crowds either. The low voice startled her, and she turned to find Xavier standing a few feet away, his thumbs hooked in his belt loops. Up close, she could see the weathered lines around his eyes, evidence of years spent under the harsh western sun. "I just needed a moment," she replied, proud that her voice remained steady despite her racing heart. He nodded, taking a step closer. "Miss Blackwood, isn't it? The doctor's daughter." "Clara," she offered, "and you're Mr. Remington." A smile touched his lips for the first time. "Xavier, though most folks just call me X." "That's an unusual name," she remarked, curious. "My mother had a fondness for books," he explained, his expression softening momentarily. Said she wanted me to have a name as extraordinary as the life she hoped I'd lead. Clara found herself drawn to the quiet intensity in his voice. And have you led an extraordinary life? He considered her question, gazing out at the darkness beyond the settlement. I've seen more of this country than most, I suppose. Drove cattle up from Texas, fought in skirmishes that history won't remember, watched towns rise from nothing. His eyes returned to hers. Nothing as extraordinary as your father's work, though. Saving lives is something that matters. You know my father, Xavier nodded. Met him last month when one of the Henderson hands took a bad fall. He didn't ask for payment, just told us to bring the man back in a week to check his arm. That's father, Clara said proudly. He believes medicine should be for everyone, not just those who can afford it. The music inside started again, the fiddle's notes drifting through the open windows. Would you care to dance, Miss Blackwood? Xavier asked unexpectedly, extending his hand. Clara hesitated only briefly before placing her fingers in his. Out here. Less crowded, he replied with a small smile that transformed his serious face. There on the porch, with only the stars as witnesses, Xavier placed one hand respectfully at her waist and began to lead her in a simple waltz. He moved with surprising grace for a man who spent his days in a saddle, and Clara found herself relaxing into the dance. You dance well for a cowboy, she remarked, surprised by her own boldness. My mother insisted on some civilized skills, he replied. Said a man should know more than just how to break horses and mend fences. They moved together easily, the space between them proper yet somehow intimate. Clara could smell leather and pine on him, so different from the cologne the town boys sometimes wore. Mr. Henderson says you're the best horseman he's ever employed, Clara said as they turned. Xavier's expression remained neutral, though his eyes warmed at her words. Henderson's a good man to work for, treats his hands fair, doesn't cut corners with his stock. Will you stay through winter? She asked, trying to keep her tone casual. The question seemed to surprise him. Haven't decided yet. I don't usually winter anywhere. He studied her face for a moment. Though Willow Creek might have reasons to reconsider that habit. Clara felt her cheeks flush and was grateful for the dim light. As the music inside ended, Xavier slowly released her, his calloused hand lingering briefly against hers. Thank you for the dance, Miss Blackwood, he said formally, though his eyes conveyed something more. Clara, she reminded him, if we're going to dance under the stars, you should call me Clara. The hint of a smile touched his lips again. Clara, he repeated, the name sounding different in his deep voice. The door to the hall opened, spilling light and noise onto the porch. Clara's father stood in the doorway, his expression shifting from concern to wariness when he spotted Xavier. Clara, your mother is looking for you, doctor. Blackwood said, his eyes never leaving the cowboy. Yes, father, Clara replied obediently. She turned to Xavier and offered a small curtsy. Thank you for the dance, Mr. Remington. Xavier tipped his hat slightly. The pleasure was mine. As Clara followed her father inside, she could feel Xavier's gaze on her back. Something had shifted between them during that simple dance, a connection formed that made her heart race with possibilities. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of music and movement, but Clara found herself constantly searching the room for Xavier. He had returned inside but remained at the edges of the gathering, occasionally engaged in conversation with Mr. Henderson or some of the other ranch hands. When it came time to leave, Clara felt a strange disappointment. She had hoped for another moment with Xavier, perhaps another dance, but he had kept his distance after their encounter on the porch. The Henderson wagon carried them back through the quiet town, stars still brilliant overhead. As they approached the Blackwood home, Clara noticed a lone rider ahead, the silhouette unmistakable even in the darkness. Xavier sat atop his horse at the crossroads, waiting. As the wagon passed, he nodded respectfully to her father and Mrs. Henderson, but his eyes sought Clara's. In that brief moment of connection, Clara felt as though the entire world had narrowed to just the two of them. "That Remington boy has a restless spirit," her father commented as they entered their home. "Men like that don't put down roots, Clara. Remember that." Clara nodded dutifully, but as she prepared for bed that night, she couldn't forget the feeling of Xavier's hand at her waist or the intensity in his gaze. For the first time in her life, she understood why the heroines in her books risked everything for love. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, promising one of the last warm days before autumn fully settled over Willow Creek. Clara hurried through her morning chores, hoping for an excuse to visit the general store where she might catch a glimpse of Xavier if he came to town for supplies. Her opportunity came when her mother discovered they were low on sugar. "Clara, would you mind running to Mr. Simmons' store? Your father needs me to prepare clean bandages for his afternoon calls." Clara tried not to appear too eager as she tied on her bonnet. "Of course, Mother." "Is there anything else we need?" With a list in hand and a basket over her arm, Clara made her way down the main street, greeting neighbors and friends who were enjoying the pleasant weather. Willow Creek looked particularly charming today, with the aspen trees beginning to turn golden along the edges of town, and the mountains rising majestically in the distance. The bell above Mr. Simmons' door jingled as she entered. The store was relatively quiet, with only Mrs. Peterson examining fabrics and old Mr. Wells discussing the price of tobacco at the counter. "Good morning, Miss Blackwood," Mr. Simmons called cheerfully. "What can I help you with today?" Clara was about to respond when the door opened behind her, the bell announcing another customer. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Something in the sudden stillness of the room and the shift in Mr. Simmons' expression told her. "Morning," Xavier's deep voice said as he removed his hat. Clara turned slowly, hoping her face didn't betray her delight at seeing him. He looked different in the daylight, the lines of his face more pronounced, his eyes a clear gray blue she hadn't been able to discern in the dim light of the previous evening. "Miss Blackwood," he greeted her with a slight nod. "Mr. Remington," she replied, her fingers tightening around the handle of her basket. Mr. Simmons cleared his throat. "What can I do for you, Remington?" "Need some supplies for Henderson," Xavier replied, handing over a list. "And if you've got any of those hard candies, I'll take a bag of those too." Clara busied herself examining her mother's list, though she was acutely aware of Xavier's presence just a few feet away. When Mr. Simmons moved to the back room to gather Xavier's supplies, an awkward silence fell over the store. "Did you enjoy the remainder of the dance?" Xavier asked quietly, moving closer to where she stood. "Yes, though the company for my first dance was particularly memorable," she replied, summoning her courage to meet his gaze. A smile touched his lips, warming his entire face. "I've been riding since dawn, but that memory kept me good company." The intimacy of his admission made her heart race. Before she could respond, Mr. Simmons returned with Xavier's supplies, breaking the moment between them. As Xavier paid for his purchases, Clara selected the items from her list, painfully aware that their brief encounter was ending. When she approached the counter to pay, Xavier was just finishing his transaction. "Allow me," he said unexpectedly, placing additional coins on the counter. "Oh, I couldn't possibly," Clara protested. "Consider it payment for the dance," Xavier insisted, his eyes holding hers. Mr. Simmons looked between them with raised eyebrows but accepted the money without comment. As they left the store together, Xavier hesitated on the boardwalk. "I'm heading back to the Henderson place now, but I was wondering if you might be at church tomorrow." The question surprised Clara. "Yes, we attend every Sunday." "Then perhaps I'll see you there," he said, settling his hat back on his head. "Good day, Miss Blackwood." Clara watched him mount his horse with fluid grace, her heart pounding as he tipped his hat once more before riding away. The simple interaction had left her breathless, and she realized with startling clarity that Xavier Remington was nothing like the local boys who had sought her attention before. Sunday morning arrived with a light frost covering the ground, evidence that winter was approaching. Clara took special care with her appearance, selecting her best blue dress and arranging her hair in a style that had taken her nearly an hour to perfect. "You look especially nice today," her mother commented as they walked to church. "Any particular reason?" Clara avoided her mother's knowing gaze. "It's the Lord's Day, Mother. Shouldn't we present our best selves?" The small church was nearly full when they arrived, and Clara's eyes immediately sought Xavier. Disappointment settled in her stomach when she didn't see him among the congregants. Throughout Reverend Wilson's sermon on faith and patience, Clara found her attention drifting to the door, hoping each creak signaled Xavier's arrival. But as the service concluded and the congregation began to file out, she resigned herself to the possibility that he had changed his mind. Outside, families gathered in small groups, discussing the sermon and making plans for Sunday dinner. Clara stood with her parents, nodding politely as Mrs. Thompson described her new grandchild in elaborate detail. "Excuse me, Dr. Blackwood." The deep voice sent a shiver down Clara's spine, and she turned to find Xavier standing before them, looking unusually formal in a clean white shirt and dark vest. His hair was slicked back, and he'd clearly made an effort to tame his usually rugged appearance. "Remington," her father acknowledged with surprise. "I don't believe I've seen you at service before." "No, sir," Xavier admitted, "but I thought it was time to reacquaint myself with some civilities." His eyes briefly met Clara's before returning to her father. "Actually, I was hoping I might have a word with you, if you have a moment." Clara watched with curiosity as her father led Xavier a short distance away. Though she couldn't hear their conversation, she could see her father's expression change from wariness to thoughtful consideration. After several minutes, they shook hands, and her father nodded in apparent agreement before returning to where Clara stood with her mother. "Mrs. Blackwood, Clara," her father said, his tone carefully neutral. "Mr. Remington has asked permission to escort Clara on a ride this afternoon, if the weather holds. I have granted my consent, provided you return before sunset." Clara could hardly contain her surprise or delight. "Thank you, Father." Her mother looked less convinced but nodded graciously. "We will expect you both for tea afterward, Mr. Remington." "I would be honored, madam," Xavier replied with unexpected formality. Plans were made for Xavier to collect Clara at 2:00, allowing the Blackwoods time for their Sunday dinner. As they parted ways outside the church, Xavier caught Clara's hand briefly, his touch sending warmth through her gloved fingers. "Until this afternoon," he said quietly, his eyes conveying far more than his words. The hours passed slowly as Clara helped her mother prepare and serve dinner, her mind constantly wandering to the afternoon ahead. When she finally excused herself to change into her riding clothes, her mother followed her upstairs. "Clara," she began, sitting on the edge of the bed while Clara selected a suitable outfit. "Your father tells me Mr. Remington was quite earnest in his request today." Clara paused, turning to her mother. "What do you mean?" He spoke of his intentions toward you with surprising candor. Her mother's expression softened. "Your father was impressed by his honesty, if not entirely convinced of his suitability." Clara's heart skipped. "His intentions?" "To court you properly," her mother clarified. "Though I must say, this seems rather sudden. You barely know the man." Clara sat beside her mother, unable to explain the connection she felt to Xavier after just 2 brief encounters. Sometimes I think the heart recognizes what the mind hasn't had time to discover." Her mother sighed, patting Clara's hand. "You've always been a romantic, just like your grandmother. Just be careful, dear. Men who have spent their lives wandering often find it difficult to stay in one place." At precisely 2:00, Xavier arrived at the Blackwood home, leading 2 horses, his own chestnut gelding and a gentle-looking mare. Clara met him on the porch, suddenly shy in his presence despite her anticipation. "You look lovely," he said simply, his eyes taking in her riding habit. "Thank you for arranging this," she replied, gesturing to the horses. "Though I must admit, I'm not an experienced rider." Xavier smiled, offering his hand to help her down the steps. Daisy here is the gentlest mare on Henderson's ranch. She'll take good care of you." With careful instruction, Xavier helped Clara mount the mare, adjusting her stirrups and making sure she was comfortable before mounting his own horse. Clara's father watched from the porch, his expression a mixture of concern and resignation. "We'll be back before sunset, sir," Xavier assured him, tipping his hat respectfully. They rode at a leisurely pace out of town, Xavier keeping close to Clara's side as she grew accustomed to Daisy's smooth gait. The afternoon sun bathed the landscape in golden light, illuminating the changing aspen leaves and distant mountains. "There's a place I'd like to show you," Xavier said, as they followed a narrow trail that wound along a small creek. "If you're comfortable riding a bit further." Clara nodded eagerly. "I'm fine. Daisy is as gentle as you promised." The trail gradually ascended, offering increasingly spectacular views of the valley below. Clara marveled at the beauty of the landscape, seeing her hometown from a perspective she'd never experienced before. "It's breathtaking," she said as they paused to rest the horses. "I've lived here my entire life, yet I've never seen Willow Creek quite like this." Xavier dismounted and helped Clara down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist slightly longer than necessary. "Sometimes we need to step away from something to truly appreciate it," he observed, securing the horses to a nearby tree. He led her to a small clearing that overlooked the entire valley, the town appearing tiny in the distance with the majestic Rocky Mountains forming a dramatic backdrop. A fallen log provided a natural bench, and Xavier gestured for Clara to sit. "I found this place my first week working for Henderson," Xavier explained, settling beside her. "I come here to think when decisions need making." Clara studied his profile as he gazed out at the vista. "And what decisions bring you here lately?" He turned to face her, his expression unusually vulnerable. "Whether it's time to stop wandering." The implication of his words hung between them, charged with possibility. Clara gathered her courage and asked the question that had been on her mind since their dance. "Why did you ask to see me today, Xavier?" He considered her question carefully before answering. "Because from the moment I saw you at that dance, something changed. I've spent 10 years drifting from one place to another, never feeling the pull to stay anywhere." His eyes held her steadily. "Until now." Clara's heart raced at his confession. "My father says men with restless spirits don't put down roots easily." "Your father is a wise man," Xavier acknowledged. "And I won't pretend I'm something I'm not. I've lived a life that wouldn't suit most women raised in a place like this." He gestured to the valley below. "But I also know that what I felt when we danced, what I feel when I'm with you, isn't something I've ever experienced before." The honesty in his words moved Clara deeply. "I hardly know you," she whispered, though the statement felt hollow even as she said it. "Then let me remedy that," Xavier replied. He turned more fully toward her. "I was born in Missouri to a school teacher and a farmer, lost them both to fever when I was 16. Headed west because there was nothing keeping me east. Worked cattle drives, broke horses, even tried my hand at mining for a spell." As he spoke, Clara could picture the young boy forced into manhood too soon, finding his way in a harsh world without guidance. "The war?" she asked softly, knowing many men his age had fought. "Caught the tail end of it," he admitted. "Nothing heroic, just a lot of senseless dying that made me value peace all the more." A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched an eagle soar on thermals above the valley. Without thinking, Clara reached for his hand, her smaller fingers sliding between his weathered ones. Xavier looked down at their joined hands with an expression of wonder. "Your turn," he said gently. "Tell me about Clara Blackwood." She smiled, surprised by how easy it was to share with him. "I'm afraid my life has been far less adventurous. Born right here in Willow Creek, raised with books and medicine as my constant companions. My father taught me to read medical texts before I was 10, and my mother made sure I could manage a household just as efficiently." "You help your father with his patients?" Xavier asked. Clara nodded. "When he allows it, I've always found medicine fascinating, though there are limited opportunities for women in the field." "That bothers you," Xavier observed astutely. "Sometimes," she admitted. "I want to help people, to make a difference. Father says I should be content with the prospect of marriage and children, but I've always wanted something more." She paused, suddenly self-conscious. "That probably sounds terribly ungrateful." Xavier shook his head. "It sounds like you have a mind of your own and dreams worth pursuing. That's nothing to apologize for." His understanding touched her deeply. The local young men who had shown interest in her had always seemed uncomfortable with her interest in medicine, preferring to steer conversations toward more suitable topics for a young lady. "What about you?" she asked. "What dreams do you pursue, riding from place to place?" Xavier looked thoughtful. "For a long time, I think I was just trying to outrun memories. Lately, though," he gazed across the valley, "I've been thinking about land of my own, a place where I could raise good horses, build something lasting. Here." Clara asked, trying to keep the hope from her voice. His eyes returned to hers. "The thought has crossed my mind more frequently in recent days." The intensity of his gaze made Clara's breath catch. They sat close enough that she could see flecks of gold in his blue-gray eyes, count the sun-bleached strands in his dark hair. When his gaze dropped to her lips, she felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. "Clara," he said softly, his voice rougher than before, "I'd very much like to kiss you if you'd permit it." No one had ever asked for her permission before, not that she had been kissed by anyone other than childish pecks from schoolboys years ago. The respect in his request made her heart swell. "Yes," she whispered, hardly believing her own boldness. Xavier lifted his free hand to gently cup her cheek, his calloused thumb brushing across her skin with surprising tenderness. He leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind. When his lips finally met hers, Clara understood why poets wrote of stars and lightning. The kiss was gentle at first, a question rather than a demand. When Clara responded, moving closer and resting her hand against his chest, Xavier deepened the kiss slightly, his arms sliding around her waist to draw her nearer. She could feel his heartbeat beneath her palm, as rapid as her own. When they finally parted, Xavier rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. "I've thought about doing that since the moment I saw you," he confessed quietly. Clara smiled, overwhelmed by the emotions coursing through her. "I'm glad you waited until now," she replied. "It made it perfect." They remained on the overlook until the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, talking of dreams and memories, sharing stories both painful and joyful. With each revelation, Clara felt the connection between them strengthening, as though they had known each other for years rather than days. As promised, Xavier returned Clara to her home before sunset, where her parents waited on the porch. The ride back had been filled with comfortable silences, and occasional touches his hand covering hers as he helped adjust her reins, her shoulder brushing his as they rode side by side. "Right on time," Dr. Blackwood observed as they approached. Xavier helped Clara dismount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. "As promised, sir," he replied, tying the horses to the hitching post. Tea was a surprisingly pleasant affair, with Xavier demonstrating manners that seemed to impress even Clara's mother. He spoke intelligently about the territory's politics, the railroad's progress, and even discussed recent medical advances that Dr. Blackwood had read about in his journals. "You're well informed for a ranch hand," Clara's father remarked, not unkindly. Xavier smiled slightly. "Reading passes the time on long cattle drives, sir, and I've been fortunate to meet interesting people in my travels." As the evening drew to a close, Xavier stood to take his leave. "Thank you for your hospitality, Doctor, and Mrs. Blackwood. Will you be staying in Willow Creek much longer, Mr. Remington?" Clara's mother asked, her tone casual though her eyes were shrewd. Xavier glanced briefly at Clara before answering. "I've committed to Henderson through winter, at least. After that, Well, I'm finding more reasons to consider a more permanent arrangement. The implication wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Dr. Blackwood cleared his throat. Clara, see Mr. Remington out while your mother and I clear the tea things. Grateful for the moment of privacy, Clara walked with Xavier to the porch. The evening had turned cool, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Thank you for today, she said softly, conscious of her parents just inside. Xavier took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. May I call on you again, perhaps Tuesday evening? I'd like that very much, Clara replied, her heart lightening at the prospect of seeing him again so soon. Xavier lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. Until Tuesday, then. Clara watched him ride away, his silhouette gradually disappearing into the gathering darkness. Inside, she found her parents in the kitchen, her father drying the dishes her mother washed. He's an interesting young man, her father commented, his tone carefully neutral. Certainly not what I expected from one of Henderson's cowboys. He seems sincere in his regard for you, her mother added, setting aside a teacup. Though I still think this is moving rather quickly. Clara helped put away the dried dishes, considering her words carefully. I know it seems sudden, but there's something different about him. Something. She struggled to find the right words. Something that feels right. Her parents exchanged a look she couldn't quite interpret. Just promise me you'll be cautious, Clara, her father said finally. Guard your heart until you're certain of his character. I will, she promised, though in truth, she feared it might already be too late for caution where Xavier Remington was concerned. The next 2 days passed slowly for Clara, filled with routine tasks that couldn't distract her from thoughts of Xavier. She helped her father with patience, assisted her mother with household chores, and even volunteered to help Mrs. Wilson organize books for the small lending library the Reverend's wife maintained for the town. On Tuesday evening, Xavier arrived promptly at 6, carrying a small bouquet of late wildflowers that he must have searched diligently to find so late in the season. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance again, wearing a clean shirt and vest, his hair neatly combed. These are beautiful, Clara said, accepting the flowers. I'm surprised you found any still blooming. Had to ride nearly to the South Ridge, Xavier admitted with a smile, but the look on your face makes it worth the journey. They spent the evening on the Blackwoods' porch, Clara's parents discreetly remaining inside while maintaining a watchful presence through the front windows. Xavier told her about his day working with a particularly stubborn colt, while Clara shared stories about the patients her father had treated. You have a healer's instincts, Xavier observed after she described helping her father set a broken arm. It's clear in the way you talk about the people you help. Father says the same, Clara replied, touched by his understanding. Though he still believes a woman's place is primarily in the home. Xavier considered this. Perhaps both are possible. The right partner wouldn't ask you to abandon something so clearly important to you. The implication in his words made Clara's heart race. That's a progressive view for a cowboy, she teased gently. I've known remarkable women who managed both, Xavier replied, his expression turning briefly distant. My mother taught school right up until she fell ill, even while running our home. As the evening cooled, Xavier reluctantly stood to leave. Henderson has me riding fence lines tomorrow, but I wondered if you might join me for Sunday dinner after church. There's something I'd like to show you. I'd like that, Clara replied, rising to walk him to his horse. In the shadows of the porch, with her parents' silhouettes visible through the window, Xavier briefly took her hand in his. These past few days have been the happiest I can remember in a very long time, he said quietly. Before Clara could respond, he leaned down and placed a soft, quick kiss on her lips, daring with her parents so near, yet so sweet she couldn't find it in her heart to object. Good night, Clara, he whispered, mounting his horse in one fluid motion. Good night, Xavier, she replied, her fingers touching her lips as she watched him ride away. The week continued in a similar pattern, with Xavier calling on Clara every other evening. Each visit deepened their connection as they shared stories from their pasts and dreams for their futures. By the time Sunday arrived, Clara found herself counting the hours until she would see him again. Church service seemed interminable, though Clara noticed with pleasure that Xavier now sat with the Henderson family rather than standing at the back as he had the previous week. When their eyes met across the crowded room, his smile made her heart flutter. After the service, Xavier approached with Mr. Henderson at his side. "Dr. Blackwood, Mrs. Blackwood," Mr. Henderson greeted them jovially. "My wife and I were hoping you might allow Clara to join us for Sunday dinner. We've invited several neighbors, and Mrs. Henderson would appreciate another young lady to balance the table." Clara recognized the thoughtful arrangement for what it was a way to provide a respectable setting for her and Xavier to spend time together. Her parents agreed readily, knowing the Hendersons to be one of the most respected families in the area. The Henderson Ranch lay 3 miles outside of town, a substantial property with a comfortable 2-story home, well-maintained barns, and extensive pastureland. Clara rode in the Henderson wagon with Beatrice, while Xavier followed on horseback. "He's different since you came along," Beatrice commented quietly as they approached the ranch. "More settled. Father says he's never seen a man take to ranching so naturally." Clara glanced back at Xavier, who rode a respectful distance behind the wagon. He mentioned wanting land of his own someday. Beatrice smiled knowingly. "Father offered him the foreman position last week, said Xavier asked for time to consider it." This news surprised Clara. A foreman position was coveted, offering stability and respect that ordinary ranch hands didn't enjoy. The fact that Xavier was considering it suggested he might truly be contemplating a more permanent life in Willow Creek. Dinner at the Henderson home was a lively affair, with 12 people gathered around the large oak table. Clara found herself seated beside Xavier, with Beatrice across from them. Mrs. Henderson proved an excellent hostess, keeping conversation flowing among her diverse guests, which included the new school teacher, the banker and his wife, and several neighboring ranchers. Throughout the meal, Clara was conscious of Xavier, beside her the occasional brush of his arm against hers, the way he quietly ensured her water glass remained filled, the subtle glances they exchanged during the conversation. He participated easily in discussions about cattle prices and the coming winter, demonstrating knowledge that clearly impressed the other ranchers. After the meal, while the older guests retired to the parlor for coffee, Xavier caught Clara's eye. "I believe I promised to show you something," he said quietly, "if you're still interested." With Beatrice as their chaperone, they slipped outside into the crisp autumn afternoon. Xavier led them toward the barn, where he spoke briefly with one of the stable hands before returning to Clara and Beatrice. "This way," he said, offering Clara his arm as they walked toward a smaller paddock set apart from the main corrals. Inside the enclosure stood a beautiful black mare with a white star on her forehead. The horse lifted her head as they approached, her ears pricking forward with interest. "This is Midnight," Xavier explained, opening the gate and stepping inside. The mare approached him immediately, nuzzling his shoulder in greeting. "She's the Mustang Beatrice mentioned to you, the one I brought in last month." Clara watched in admiration as the horse responded to Xavier's gentle touch, clearly trusting him completely despite her wild origins. "She's beautiful," Clara said, staying outside the fence. "I've never seen a horse so black." "Come meet her," Xavier encouraged, extending his hand. "She's gentle now." Clara hesitated, looking to Beatrice, who nodded encouragingly. "Go ahead." Xavier has a gift with horses that even Father says is remarkable. Taking a deep breath, Clara allowed Xavier to help her through the gate. The mare watched her curiously but didn't shy away. "Hold your hand out, palm flat," Xavier instructed, standing close behind Clara. "Let her come to you." Clara did, as he suggested, her heart racing as the powerful animal approached. Midnight sniffed her hand cautiously before pressing her velvety muzzle against Clara's palm. "She likes you," Xavier said, his voice warm with approval. Most people she still keeps her distance from. How did you gentle her so quickly? Clara asked, amazed by the mare's calm demeanor. Xavier moved to stand beside the horse, running his hand along her sleek neck. Patience, mostly, understanding that fear drives most resistance. He glanced at Clara with a small smile. Horses aren't so different from people in that way. Show them respect and kindness, prove they can trust you, and most will meet you halfway. There was something in his expression that suggested he wasn't speaking only of horses. Clara stroked Midnight's nose, considering his words. Mr. Henderson offered you the foreman position, she said quietly, watching his reaction. Xavier's eyebrows rose slightly. News travels fast. Beatrice mentioned it, Clara admitted. Will you accept? He was silent for a moment, his hand continuing to stroke the mare's neck. I've been giving it serious thought, he finally replied. It's a good opportunity. Henderson runs a solid operation, treats his people fairly. But, Clara prompted, sensing his hesitation. Xavier met her gaze directly. But if I stay, it wouldn't be just for a job. And I want to be sure that the other reason I'm considering putting down roots here feels the same way. Clara's heart pounded as she understood his meaning. And what if she does? She asked softly. Feel the same way. Xavier stepped closer, close enough that Clara could see the flecks of gold in his eyes, smell the clean scent of soap and leather that seemed to always surround him. Then I'd have to tell Henderson I'm accepting his offer, Xavier replied, his voice low and intimate despite Beatrice's presence a discreet distance away. Because I've found something here worth staying for. Clara gathered her courage, placing her hand lightly on his arm. I think you should accept the position. The smile that transformed Xavier's face made Clara's breath catch. He covered her hand with his own, his expression serious despite his smile. I don't want to rush you, Clara. Whatever this is between us, and I believe it's something rare and precious, I want to give it the time it deserves. Time, Clara agreed, though her heart already felt certain in a way she couldn't fully explain. Though sometimes the heart knows what the mind is still discovering. Xavier's eyes softened at her words. With a quick glance to ensure Beatrice was still maintaining a respectful distance, he leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to Clara's forehead. I'll speak with Henderson tomorrow, he promised. The significance of the moment wasn't lost on Clara. For a man who had spent a decade wandering, the decision to accept a permanent position represented a profound shift, one that had everything to do with her. As October gave way to November, Xavier became a regular visitor at the Blackwood home. Dr. Blackwood gradually warmed to the young man, especially after Xavier helped him through a difficult night when 3 injured miners were brought to town following an accident. Xavier had stayed up all night, assisting where he could, demonstrating a steady calm that impressed the doctor. He's not what I expected, Dr. Blackwood admitted to Clara one evening after Xavier had departed. There's depth to him that most men his age haven't developed. Clara smiled, pleased by her father's assessment. He's lived more life in his 28 years than most men twice his age. The first snow fell in mid-November, transforming Willow Creek into a winter wonderland. Xavier arrived at the Blackwood home that evening with his coat dusted white, his cheeks ruddy from the cold. It's beautiful out there, he said, as Clara helped him remove his snow-covered coat. The whole world turned quiet and new. They sat by the fire in the parlor, Clara's parents maintaining a presence in the adjoining room that provided the illusion of privacy while ensuring propriety. Outside, the snow continued to fall, creating a cocoon of warmth and intimacy inside. Henderson is sending me to Denver next week, Xavier said, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. He needs someone to finalize contracts with buyers for spring calves. Clara felt a pang of disappointment. How long will you be gone? A week, maybe 2 depending on the weather, he replied, reaching for her hand. I'll miss you every day. The simple honesty in his words touched Clara deeply. I'll miss you too. Xavier hesitated, then reached into his pocket. I have something for you. A token to remember me by while I'm away. He pressed a small object into her palm, a beautifully carved wooden heart, small enough to fit in her hand, polished to a smooth shine. Delicate flowers were etched along its border, with her initials carved in the center. Xavier, it's beautiful, Clara breathed, running her finger over the detailed carving. Did you make this? He nodded, a hint of self-consciousness in his expression. My father taught me to carve when I was young. I haven't done much of it in recent years, but I wanted to create something for you. Clara closed her fingers around the wooden heart, deeply moved by the personal nature of the gift. I'll keep it with me while you're gone. Xavier's eyes held hers, conveying emotions too profound for words. Clara, he said softly, these past weeks have been the happiest of my life. I never expected to find someone like you, someone who makes me want to be a better man, who makes me see a future I never thought I wanted. Clara's heart raced at his words. I feel the same, she admitted. From the moment we danced under the stars, something changed for me too. He shifted closer, taking both her hands in his. When I return from Denver, there's something important I want to ask you, but I need you to know that whatever your answer, my feelings won't change. Though he didn't elaborate, Clara understood his meaning. The knowledge that Xavier was contemplating a proposal filled her with joy and nervous anticipation. They had known each other barely 2 months, yet she couldn't imagine her life without him in it. I'll be waiting, she promised, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The days following Xavier's departure for Denver passed slowly for Clara. She threw herself into helping her father with his patients, assisting her mother with preparations for the upcoming Christmas season, and volunteering with the church's efforts to gather supplies for families struggling with the harsh winter. Each night, she held the carved wooden heart, running her fingers over the initials and thinking of Xavier in Denver. The separation, though difficult, gave Clara time to reflect on the whirlwind romance that had changed her life so completely in such a short time. She had no doubts about her feelings for Xavier. The connection between them had been immediate and profound in a way she couldn't fully explain. Yet she appreciated this time to consider what a future with him might mean. As the Henderson ranch foreman, he would have a respected position in the community, but their life would still be bound to the rhythms and demands of ranch work. There would be long days, difficult seasons, and the constant challenges that came with raising cattle in the Colorado Territory. Clara found herself picturing that life with surprising clarity, a small house of their own. Perhaps children with Xavier's intense eyes and quiet strength, a garden where she could grow herbs for medicine, maybe even a small practice where she could help her neighbors when the doctor was unavailable. 10 days after Xavier's departure, Clara was helping her father organize his medical supplies when the office door burst open. Beatrice Henderson stood in the doorway, her face flushed from the cold and exertion. Clara, she gasped, struggling to catch her breath. You must come quickly. It's Xavier. Clara's heart nearly stopped. What's happened? Is he hurt? He's back from Denver, Beatrice explained, accepting the glass of water Dr. Blackwood offered. He rode through the night to get here. Father says he's exhausted but insisting on seeing you immediately. Relief flooded Clara, followed by confusion. Why would he push so hard to return early? Beatrice's expression turned grave. There was trouble in Denver, rumors about outlaws planning to raid isolated ranches this winter. Xavier learned that our ranch might be targeted because of Father's cattle contracts. Dr. Blackwood frowned. That's concerning news, but why the urgency to see Clara? Because he's leaving again, Beatrice said, her eyes apologetic as she looked at Clara. Father is sending him with our most experienced hands to move the best breeding stock to our northern pastures, where they'll be safer. They're departing within the hour. Clara felt as though the floor had dropped from beneath her feet. How long will he be gone? Most of the winter, Beatrice replied softly. The northern pastures are nearly inaccessible once the heavy snows come. They'll be isolated until spring thaw. Without waiting for her father's permission, Clara grabbed her coat and followed Beatrice outside, where a wagon waited. The ride to the Henderson ranch seemed interminable, though Beatrice filled in more details about the threat Xavier had uncovered in Denver. When they finally arrived, the ranch was a flurry of activity. Men loaded supplies onto pack horses, checked weapons, and prepared for what would clearly be a challenging journey. Clara scanned the busy yard, searching for Xavier. She spotted him near the barn, deep in conversation with Mr. Henderson. Even from a distance, she could see the exhaustion in his posture, the tension in his shoulders. When he turned and saw her, however, his entire demeanor changed. He said something quickly to Mr. Henderson before striding toward her, his eyes never leaving her face. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with fatigue as he reached her. "I wasn't sure you'd come in time." "Beatrice said you rode through the night," Clara replied, taking in his appearance with concern. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and several days' worth of stubble covered his jaw. "You must be exhausted." Xavier shook his head dismissively. "I couldn't leave without seeing you." He drew her away from the busy yard to a quieter spot near the paddock where they had stood with Midnight weeks earlier. The mare was now among the horses being prepared for the journey north. "I'm sorry about this," Xavier said, his expression troubled. "The timing couldn't be worse." Clara tried to hide her disappointment. "You're doing what needs to be done, I understand." Xavier took her hands in his gaze intense despite his fatigue. "Before I left for Denver, I told you I had something important to ask when I returned." He smiled ruefully. "This isn't how I imagined this moment, but I can't leave without asking." Clara's heart pounded as Xavier reached into his pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. From it, he produced a simple gold ring with a single pearl set in its center. "I bought this in Denver," he explained, his voice steady despite the emotions Clara could see in his eyes. "I had planned a proper courtship, time to prove myself worthy of you, but circumstances have forced my hand." He held the ring between them, a symbol of promises yet to be spoken. "Clara Blackwood, I know we've known each other a short time, but in that time, you've become everything to me. I love you in a way I never thought possible, and if you'll have me, I want to spend my life proving that love to you every day." Tears filled Clara's eyes as Xavier continued. "I can't offer you wealth or an easy life. What I can promise is my heart, my protection, and my unwavering devotion for as long as I live." He took a deep breath. "Will you marry me, Clara?" Despite the rushed circumstances, the chaos of preparation around them, and the knowledge that acceptance would mean months of separation, Clara had never been more certain of anything in her life. "Yes," she whispered, her voice strengthening as she repeated, "Yes, Xavier, I will marry you." The joy that transformed his exhausted face was like sunrise after the darkest night. Xavier slipped the ring onto her finger, where it fit as though made for her hand. Then he pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she were the most precious thing in the world. "I had hoped to speak to your father first," he murmured against her hair. "To do things properly." "We can speak to him together," Clara assured him. "He's come to respect you greatly." Xavier drew back slightly, cupping her face in his hands. "I have to leave within the hour." The northern pastures are a 3-day ride in good weather, and the skies threatening more snow. The reality of their imminent separation dampened their joy, but Clara refused to let it overshadow this moment. "When you return in spring, we'll be married. That's something worth waiting for." Xavier smiled, though his eyes remained serious. "It will be a difficult winter. The northern pastures are isolated, and with the threat of raiders, we'll need to remain vigilant." "Promise me you'll be careful," Clara said, suddenly afraid for him. "Promise you'll come back to me." "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," Xavier vowed. He leaned down and kissed her with a passion that conveyed all the love and longing he felt, a kiss that had to sustain them through months of separation. When they finally parted, Clara pressed the wooden heart he had carved into his palm. "Take this with you," she said. "A reminder that my heart goes with you wherever you are." Xavier closed his fingers around the carving, his expression solemn as he tucked it securely into his shirt pocket, close to his own heart. "I'll keep it with me always." They returned to the yard hand in hand, where Clara was surprised to find her parents had arrived. Beatrice, it seemed, had sent for them, understanding the significance of the moment. Dr. Blackwood approached Xavier with a serious expression. "Henderson told me about the threat." "You believe it's credible?" Xavier nodded. "Yes, sir. The men I spoke with in Denver had reliable information. Several ranches south of here have already been hit. And this plan to move the breeding stock north? It's the safest option," Xavier confirmed. "The northern pastures are difficult to access in winter, easier to defend if trouble comes." Dr. Blackwood studied the younger man carefully. "Henderson tells me you volunteered to lead this expedition, despite having just returned from Denver." "Yes, sir." "I know those mountains better than most of Henderson's men." Clara's father glanced down at his daughter's hand, where the pearl ring now rested. His expression softened slightly. "I see you've spoken to my daughter." Xavier straightened, meeting the older man's gaze directly. "I have, sir. I've asked Clara to be my wife, and she's done me the great honor of accepting. I had hoped to speak with you first, but circumstances intervened." To Clara's surprise, her father extended his hand to Xavier. "You've proven yourself to be a man of character, Remington. I believe you'll take good care of my daughter." "With everything I am," Xavier promised, shaking Dr. Blackwood's hand firmly. Mrs. Blackwood stepped forward, her eyes bright with unshed tears as she embraced Clara. "It seems we have a wedding to plan for spring," she said, her voice wavering slightly. Mr. Henderson approached, his expression apologetic. "I hate to interrupt, but the men are ready, Xavier. We need to move out before the weather turns." Reality intruded on their brief moment of joy. Xavier turned to Clara, taking her hands one last time. "Wait for me," he said softly. "Always," she promised. Their goodbye was necessarily brief, a final kiss, a whispered, "I love you." And then Xavier was mounting his horse, taking his place at the head of the line of men and animals preparing to depart. Clara stood with her parents and the Hendersons, watching as the group moved slowly northward, eventually disappearing into the snowy landscape. As Clara fingered the pearl ring on her hand, she felt a strange mixture of joy and apprehension. She was engaged to the man she loved, yet he was riding away from her, facing potential danger in the isolated mountain pastures. "He'll be back before you know it," Beatrice said, linking her arm through Clara's as they returned to the Henderson house. "And then you'll be Mrs. Xavier Remington." The thought brought a smile to Clara's face, despite her concerns. Mrs. Xavier Remington, a name and identity she had never imagined for herself 2 months ago, but now couldn't imagine living without. Winter descended on Willow Creek with a vengeance in the weeks following Xavier's departure. Heavy snowfalls isolated the town for days at a time, and Clara found herself constantly watching the northern horizon, wondering how Xavier and the other men were faring in the mountain pastures. Christmas came and went, a subdued affair with many families concerned about loved ones working cattle in distant locations. Clara wore her engagement ring proudly, though the absence of her fiancé cast a shadow over the holiday celebrations. January brought bitterly cold temperatures and more snow. Clara threw herself into helping her father, whose services were in high demand as winter illnesses spread through the community. The work kept her busy during daylight hours, but nights were lonely, filled with thoughts of Xavier and prayers for his safety. No news came from the northern pastures, which Mr. Henderson assured her was expected. "The pass is likely snowed in completely," he explained. "We won't hear anything until the thaw begins." February brought a brief respite from the harsh weather, enough that supplies could be brought in from larger settlements to the east. Clara eagerly questioned the drivers about news from other ranches, but none had information about the Henderson operation to the north. As March approached, Clara began preparations for a spring wedding. though no date could be set until Xavier returned. Her mother helped her select fabric for a wedding dress, and the ladies of the church offered assistance with planning the celebration. "You're remarkably calm for a bride without a firm wedding date," Mrs. Wilson observed as they worked on alteration patterns. Clara smiled, touching her ring. "When you're certain about the person, the timing seems less important." It was in late March, as the first signs of spring began to appear in the valley, that Clara was awakened in the middle of the night by urgent knocking at the front door. She heard her father moving down the stairs, his voice mingling with another she didn't recognize. Pulling on her robe, Clara moved to the top of the stairs, listening. "They made it through the pass just before dark," a man was saying. "Henderson sent me to fetch you right away." "How bad?" her father asked, already gathering his medical bag. "Remington took a bullet to the shoulder 3 days ago. Fever's set in. Henderson's afraid of infection." Clara's heart seemed to stop at the mention of Xavier's name. Without thinking, she rushed down the stairs. "I'm coming with you," she said, already turning to dress. Her father didn't argue, recognizing both her medical knowledge and her personal stake in the situation. Within minutes, they were in a wagon racing toward the Henderson ranch, where the men from the northern pastures had finally returned. The scene at the ranch was one of controlled chaos. Men tended to exhausted horses while others unloaded supplies and the few cattle they had brought back with them. Clara scanned the yard desperately, searching for Xavier. Mr. Henderson met them at the house, his expression grim. "He's inside." "Mrs. Henderson is with him now." Clara followed her father into the house and up the stairs to a bedroom where Xavier lay on a bed, his face flushed with fever, his breathing labored. Mrs. Henderson sat beside him, applying cool cloths to his forehead. "Thank God you're here," she said, rising to make room for Dr. Blackwood. "The fever's been rising steadily since they arrived." Clara moved to Xavier's side, her medical training temporarily overriding her emotional response. His shirt had been removed, revealing a bandaged shoulder that showed signs of infection. His skin burned beneath her touch as she stroked his face. "Xavier," she called softly. "Xavier, can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered, then opened slightly, his gaze unfocused. "Clara." He murmured, his voice rough with pain and fever. "I'm here," she assured him, squeezing his hand. "Father's here too. We're going to take care of you." Dr. Blackwood examined the wound carefully, his expression growing more concerned as he assessed the damage. "The bullet went clean through, which is fortunate, but there's significant infection. We need to clean this thoroughly and get the fever down." What followed was one of the longest nights of Clara's life. She worked alongside her father, cleaning Xavier's wound, applying poultices to draw out the infection, and continuously bathing his fevered skin with cool water. Xavier drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes recognizing Clara, other times lost in delirious memories of the attack that had left him wounded. "Raiders came at dawn," he muttered during one lucid moment. "6 of them. We were ready," warned the others. "SHH," Clara soothed, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. "Save your strength. You can tell us everything when you're stronger." As dawn broke, Dr. Blackwood finally sat back, wiping his brow with exhaustion. "We've done all we can for now. The wound is clean, and I've given him quinine for the fever. The rest is up to him and God." Clara nodded, never leaving Xavier's side. "I'm staying with him." Her father didn't argue, recognizing the determination in his daughter's eyes. "I'll return this evening to check on him. Send word immediately if his condition worsens." For 3 days, Clara remained at Xavier's bedside, leaving only when absolutely necessary. She spoke to him constantly, reminding him of their plans, of the future that awaited them when he recovered. Gradually, his fever began to subside, and on the 4th day, he awoke fully lucid for the first time. "Clara," he said, his voice weak but clear as his eyes focused on her face. "You're really here." Relief flooded through her as she took his hand. "Where else would I be when my future husband needs me?" A ghost of his usual smile touched his lips. "I promised I'd come back to you." "Yes, you did," she agreed, blinking back tears. "Though next time I'd prefer you return without a bullet hole." Xavier attempted to sit up, wincing at the pain in his shoulder. Clara gently helped him into a more comfortable position, arranging pillows to support his injured side. "The others?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "Did everyone make it back?" "Everyone returned safely," Clara assured him. "Mr. Henderson says you're the reason they all survived. You spotted the raiders before they could ambush the camp." Xavier relaxed slightly at this news. "We lost some cattle, but managed to protect most of the breeding stock." He reached for her hand, his grip weaker than usual but still warm and reassuring. "I kept your heart with me," he said, gesturing weakly toward his clothes, which had been placed on a nearby chair. Clara retrieved his shirt, finding the wooden heart still in the pocket. The carving was slightly worn now, as though fingers had traced its patterns repeatedly. The thought of Xavier holding this token during the long winter months brought tears to her eyes. "It brought me luck," he said softly. "Even when the bullet hit, I knew I'd make it back to you." Clara leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "And now you have. The rest is just details." Over the next 2 weeks, Xavier regained his strength under Clara's careful attention. Dr. Blackwood pronounced the wound healing well, though he cautioned that full recovery would take time. Xavier would need to limit the use of his arm for at least another month. "Which means no spring roundup for you," Mr. Henderson said when he visited Xavier's sick room. "But I'm keeping your position. A foreman who brings all his men back safely deserves loyalty." As April bloomed across the valley, Xavier was finally strong enough to return to the small cabin that came with his foreman position. Clara visited daily, bringing meals and changing his bandages, their time together strengthening the bond that had formed so quickly the previous fall. "Have you thought about when you might want to have the wedding?" Xavier asked one afternoon as they sat on the cabin's small porch, watching spring unfold across the pastures. Clara smiled, taking his hand. "I was thinking June would be nice. The wildflowers will be blooming, and you should be fully recovered by then." Xavier nodded, his eyes warm as he gazed at her. "June it is then, though if I had my way, I'd marry you tomorrow." "Mother would never forgive us," Clara laughed. "She's been planning this wedding since the day we announced our engagement." They fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that comes when two people are so attuned to each other that words become secondary. Xavier's arm slipped around Clara's waist, drawing her closer to his uninjured side. "I had a lot of time to think during those months in the northern pastures," he said eventually. "About our future, what kind of life I want to build with you." Clara looked up at him curiously. "And what did you decide?" "That being Henderson's foreman is a good start, but not my final destination." His expression turned thoughtful. "There's land for sale about 5 miles east of town. Good water access, enough acreage for a small ranch operation. I've been saving for years, never having a reason to put down roots." "Now I do." Clara's heart swelled at the implication. "Your own ranch?" Xavier nodded. "I spoke with Henderson about it yesterday. He's supportive, even offered to sell me some of his stock to get started." He turned to face her fully. "It would be a modest beginning. The house would be small at first, though we could add to it as we grow. And there would be room for whatever you might want to garden for medicinal herbs, space for you to see patients if your father agrees to train you further." The care with which he had considered her dreams and ambitions touched Clara deeply. "It sounds perfect," she said softly. "It would be ours," Xavier continued, his expression earnest. "Something we build together, a legacy for our children someday." The mention of children brought a flush to Clara's cheeks and a warmth to her heart. The vision of their future grew clearer with each passing day, a home filled with love. Perhaps children with Xavier's strength and her compassion, a life built on mutual respect and shared dreams. "I love you," she said simply, leaning against his good shoulder. "And I can't wait to begin our life together." Xavier pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "1 more month," he murmured. "1 more month and you'll be Mrs. Remington." As June approached, preparations for the wedding occupied most of Clara's time. Her mother and the ladies of the church transformed the simple ceremony into a community celebration, with seemingly everyone in Willow Creek contributing in some way. Mr. Simmons donated fabric for decorations. Mrs. Wilson organized a group to prepare food for the reception. And even Dr. Blackwood, usually removed from such social planning, offered to build an arch under which the couple would exchange their vows. Xavier, meanwhile, divided his time between his duties as Henderson's foreman and preparations on the land he had purchased. With help from other ranch hands, he began construction on a modest home that would be ready shortly after the wedding. Clara visited the site whenever possible, watching with growing excitement as their future home took shape against the backdrop of the Colorado mountains. The evening before their wedding, Xavier took Clara to their land, wanting a moment of privacy away from the well-meaning but constant presence of family and friends. The house stood nearly complete, its simple lines promising shelter and comfort for the life they would build together. "Tomorrow seems both too distant and too near," Clara admitted as they stood hand in hand, surveying what would soon be their home. "I've waited for this day since you left for the northern pastures, yet now I can hardly believe it's finally here." Xavier smiled, lifting her hand to place a kiss on her palm. "I've been waiting for you my entire life, though I didn't know it until that harvest dance." Clara leaned into his embrace, savoring the strength and warmth of his arms around her. "Do you remember what you said that night?" "About my first dance being memorable." "I remember everything about that night," Xavier replied, his voice low with emotion. "The way you looked in the moonlight, how perfectly you fit in my arms, the moment I realized I'd found a reason to stop wandering." Clara turned in his embrace to face him. "You were my first real dance," she said softly. "My first real kiss, and tomorrow you'll be my husband, my forever." Xavier's eyes darkened with emotion as he bent to capture her lips in a tender kiss that spoke of all they had overcome and all that awaited them. When they finally parted, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "Until tomorrow, Miss Blackwood," he whispered. "Tomorrow, when you become Mrs. Remington." The wedding day dawned clear and bright, as though nature itself blessed their union. Clara stood in her childhood bedroom, her mother and Beatrice helping her into the simple but elegant wedding dress they had spent weeks creating. The ivory satin gleamed in the morning light, its modest design enhanced by delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. "You look beautiful," her mother said, tears glistening in her eyes as she secured the final buttons. "Xavier won't be able to take his eyes off you." Clara smiled, touching the pearl ring that would soon be joined by a wedding band. "I can hardly believe this is real," she admitted. "That after today, I'll be his wife." "You two were meant for each other," Beatrice said, adjusting the small wreath of wildflowers that crowned Clara's upswept hair. "Anyone who's seen you together knows that." A knock at the door announced her father's arrival. Dr. Blackwood entered, stopping short at the sight of his daughter in her wedding finery. For a moment, the usually composed doctor seemed at a loss for words. "Clara," he finally managed, his voice thick with emotion, "you are every inch your mother's daughter today." Clara embraced her father, careful not to wrinkle her dress. "Thank you for accepting, Xavier," she said quietly. "Your blessing means everything to us both." Dr. Blackwood nodded, clearing his throat. "He's proven himself a man of integrity and courage." "I couldn't ask for a better husband for my daughter." He offered his arm with formal dignity. "Now, I believe there's a rather nervous young man waiting for his bride at the church." The small church was filled to capacity, decorated with wildflowers and ribbons that transformed the simple space into something magical. As Clara walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her eyes fixed on Xavier, who stood tall and handsome at the altar, his expression one of wonder as he watched her approach. He had never looked more handsome, his dark hair neatly trimmed, his usually weathered appearance softened by the formal suit he wore for the occasion. But it was the love shining in his eyes that took Clara's breath away, open, unguarded, and absolute. When her father placed her hand in Xavier's, Clara felt a sense of rightness that transcended the ceremony itself. This was where she belonged, her hand in his, their futures intertwined. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Wilson began, his voice carrying through the hushed church. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Xavier James Remington and Clara Elizabeth Blackwood in holy matrimony." The ceremony passed in a blur of emotion for Clara, though certain moments remained crystal clear in her memory, the warmth of Xavier's hands holding hers, the slight tremor in his voice as he recited his vows, the cool slide of the gold wedding band joining her pearl engagement ring. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Wilson declared, his smile broad and genuine. "Mr. Remington, you may kiss your bride." Xavier's hands gently cradled Clara's face as he leaned down to seal their union with a kiss that balanced respect for their audience with the depth of his love. When they turned to face the congregation as husband and wife for the first time, the church erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration that followed at the Henderson Ranch lasted well into the evening, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed the entire community twice over. Xavier remained by Clara's side throughout, his hand often finding hers as though he couldn't quite believe she was finally his wife. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the celebration, Xavier led Clara away from the festivities toward where their horses waited, saddled and ready. "Are we leaving?" Clara asked, surprised by the sudden departure. Xavier smiled, helping her mount despite the challenge of her wedding dress. "I have one more surprise for you," he explained, swinging into his own saddle. "Something I've been working on when you thought I was at the construction site." Intrigued, Clara followed as Xavier led them toward their new property. As they crested the final hill, she gasped at the sight before her. Their small house stood complete, smoke rising from the chimney, windows glowing with warm lamplight. A pathway lined with lanterns led from where they stood to the front door, creating a magical welcome. "Xavier," she breathed, overwhelmed by the scene. "It's perfect." He helped her dismount, his expression a mixture of pride and nervousness. Henderson's wife helped with the interior furnishings. "It's simple, but I thought you might prefer to spend our first night as husband and wife in our own home rather than at the boarding house in town." Tears of joy filled Clara's eyes as she took in the care and thought behind his surprise. "It's the most wonderful gift anyone has ever given me." Xavier lifted her into his arms, careful of her dress. "Welcome home, Mrs. Remington," he said softly, carrying her across the threshold into their new life together. The interior was indeed simple but thoughtfully arranged, with sturdy furniture, colorful quilts, and small touches that already made it feel like home. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and fresh wildflowers adorned the table, evidence of the friends who had helped prepare this welcome. As Xavier set her gently on her feet, Clara turned in a slow circle, taking in every detail of their first home. "When did you manage all this?" "The house wasn't nearly this complete when we visited yesterday." Xavier smiled, removing his jacket and hanging it on a peg by the door. "Henderson gave the men the day off to help finish everything while you were preparing for the ceremony. Mrs. Henderson and some of the other ladies brought the furnishings and supplies earlier today." Clara was touched by the community effort that had gone into creating this perfect beginning for them. "We are blessed with good friends," she said softly. "We are," Xavier agreed, moving to stand before her. With gentle reverence, he removed the flower crown from her hair, letting the chestnut waves fall around her shoulders. "But right now, Mrs. Remington, I find myself wanting to be alone with my wife." The tenderness in his voice made Clara's heart race as he drew her into his arms. This man, her first real dance, her first kiss, her husband had changed her life in ways she could never have imagined that night at the harvest dance. and now they had the rest of their lives to discover what that change would bring. "I love you, Xavier Remington," she whispered, rising on tiptoe to meet his kiss. "Today, tomorrow, and for all the days to come." "And I love you, Clara Remington," he replied, his arms tightening around her as though he never intended to let go. "My heart, my home, my forever." As the stars appeared above their small house on the Colorado frontier, Clara knew with absolute certainty that the journey that had begun with a dance under the stars had led her exactly where she was meant to be, in the arms of the man who had been her first kiss, and who would now be her forever. 10 years later, Clara stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching as Xavier taught their 8-year-old son James to gentle a young colt in the paddock nearby. Their 6-year-old daughter Elizabeth sat on the fence, her legs swinging as she called out encouragement to her brother. The X-Bar C Ranch, as they had named their property, had prospered under Xavier's careful management. What had begun as a modest operation now encompassed over 500 acres, with a reputation for quality horses that brought buyers from as far as Denver. Clara's own dreams had flourished alongside the ranch. With her father's blessing and training, she had established herself as a midwife and healer, using a portion of their expanded home as a small clinic where she tended to neighbors when the doctor was unavailable or the journey to town too difficult. "Mama, look," Elizabeth called, pointing excitedly as James successfully led the young colt in a circle. "Jamie did it," Clara smiled, waving acknowledgement to her children. Xavier looked up, catching her eye across the yard. Even after 10 years of marriage, that single glance could still make her heart race, still contained all the love and connection that had sparked between them at their first meeting. As the afternoon sun gilded the scene before her, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them here from a harvest dance and a first kiss to this rich, full life they had built together. There had been challenges, of course. The early years had been lean, with harsh winters and difficult harvests. The birth of James had been complicated, requiring her father's intervention to save both Clara and the baby. And 3 years ago, a prairie fire had threatened everything they had built, stopped only by the heroic efforts of Xavier and neighboring ranchers. Yet through it all, their love had remained constant, deepening with each challenge overcome, each joy shared. Xavier had kept his promises to love her, to support her dreams, to build a life worthy of the trust she had placed in him. As the children's lesson concluded, Xavier sent them to complete their evening chores before dinner. He crossed the yard to join Clara on the porch, his movements still possessing the fluid grace that had first caught her attention all those years ago. Time had added silver threads to his dark hair and deepened the lines around his eyes, but to Clara, he was more handsome than ever. "Successful lesson?" she asked as he climbed the steps to stand beside her. Xavier nodded, slipping an arm around her waist. "James has your gentle touch. The animals respond to him like they do to you." "And Elizabeth has your spirit," Clara observed, leaning into his embrace. "Always ready for the next adventure," Xavier chuckled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "God help us when she's older. We'll be chasing off suitors with a shotgun." They stood in comfortable silence, watching as the sun began its descent behind the mountains. In the distance, they could see riders approaching, likely Dr. Blackwood and Mrs. Blackwood, who had planned to join them for dinner. Though semi-retired now, Clara's father still assisted with particularly difficult cases and took great delight in teaching his medical knowledge to his grandchildren. "Are you happy, Clara?" Xavier asked suddenly, his voice quiet and serious. Clara turned in his arms, surprised by the question. "Immensely," she replied without hesitation. "Are you?" Xavier's expression softened as he gazed down at her. "More than I ever thought possible." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch as tender as it had been on their wedding day. "Sometimes I still can't believe you chose me, that you saw something worth loving in a wandering cowboy with nothing to offer but his heart." "That heart was all I ever wanted," Clara said softly, rising on tiptoe to press a gentle kiss to his lips. That and the promise of forever. Xavier's arms tightened around her as he deepened the kiss, still able to make her breathless after all these years. When they finally parted, his eyes held the same intensity they had the night of their first dance. "Forever," he agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "And somehow, it still doesn't seem long enough to love you." As their children's laughter echoed from the barn and the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, Clara thanked God for the harvest dance that had brought Xavier into her life, for the cowboy who had been her first kiss and who had indeed become her forever.